大家下午好，我是华文媒体集团新闻中心的总编辑韩咏梅，欢迎也谢谢大家参加我们这次的讨论会。我们从小背诵信约，我们是新加坡公民，誓愿不分种族、言语、宗教，团结一致，建设一个公正平等的民主社会。种族是我们这个国家最重要的议题之一，也是我们华人、马来人、印度人、欧亚混血儿等能不能成为我们的关键。建设一个共同的社会是我们的共同目标，然而对于建设的方式、融合的速度，甚至包括最终的理想状态应该是什么样子的，我们每个人的观点不一样。新加坡历史上发生过激烈的种族冲突，为此付出惨痛的代价，因此过去几十年来大家避免触碰这个敏感的课题。近年来全球化的冲击与冲突，使得一些过去因为敏感而不愿或不敢讨论的课题再被提起，如今还冠上了不同的理论和名词，包括身份政治、白人特权衍生出来的华人特权、华人优势等等，加上最近在社交媒体上一波又一波快速流传起来涉及种族的小冲突，让我们不得不正视这个敏感的种族课题。种族课题讨论的范围可以很广，观点也可以很多元，这里有文化因素、时代背景、成长环境、个人生活体验等等，他们都形塑每个人不同的看法。联合早报一直致力于刊登多元的观点和声音，但是我们未必能收集到所有的意见，于是我们决定做一个系列报道，种族与我们，主动探讨这个课题。前2天我们把专题中学者对这个课题的讨论翻译成英文，方便大家阅读。此外，我们制作的视频《种族与我们75%的尴尬》也提供了双语字幕。视频推出2天，获得很多反馈，说明了促进讨论是化解矛盾的最佳方式。我们今天提供华语和英语的同声传译，希望大家能用自己最舒服的语言畅所欲言。英语是新加坡各族共同的语言，今天出席的各族朋友，多数也以英语进行这个课题的沟通，所以我们尝试提供华语和英语的同步翻译。往后如果我们再举行跨种族讨论，有需要的话，我们也会尝试提供其他语言的翻译。今天的论坛是这个系列的压轴，但肯定不是结束。我们邀请各界朋友和各种族朋友分享大家的看法，聆听彼此的心声。我们希望缝制一张百纳贝，呈现不同的观点。最后，希望这张百纳贝能把我们从矛盾与撕裂中缝合起来，给这个彼此冷漠对待的社会提供温暖。现在我把时间交给今天的主持，联合早报的言论组主任叶鹏飞，希望大家度过一个充实的下午。谢谢。
谢谢咏梅。就如咏梅所说的，今天是一个非常难得的机会，所以我们也希望大家能够畅所欲言。那么现在我再来介绍我们的来宾。在我左手边第一位是沈璧浩先生，他是资深的基层义工和作家。沈先生在当中是属于我们的老前辈了，经历和见证了建国以来的种族关系的变化。那他也曾经在实行种族主义政策的南非就是待过，所以可能这方面他也有可以比较的地方。那在就是通过他的话，我们希望能够先提供一个大的视角，让我们就是明白说这一次讨论它的意义何在。那第2位来宾呢，是伊萨德，他是前官委议员，也是民间组织和平玫瑰的创办人兼会长。他在大学的时代就很关注本地不同宗教之间的交流，也致力于这方面的努力。宗教和种族在本地都属于敏感课题，他的实际经验相信能为今天的讨论增添色彩。那我们第3位来宾呢是蔡文毅，他是新加坡独立智库亚当斯密中心的研究员，他对于本地的社会课题有所研究，他也写过一本书，从自由主义的立场分析新加坡的政策讨论。那作为年纪比较轻的华族， 他个人对于新加坡的种族关系可能也有不一样的见解。下一位来宾呢，是伯乐，他是外籍劳工中心执行理事长，他曾经在人力部工作多年，对于外劳的问题有非常深刻的了解。作为一名家庭血缘多元化的个人，这部分他有很精彩的故事可以分享。他也能够为今天的讨论提供很有趣和新鲜的视角。那我们最后一位来宾，丁劭诗博士，他是国立教育学院教育研究处助理处长兼教学法与实践研究中心研究员，没有读错吧？劭诗是研究社会学出身，所以对种族关系这个社会现象有比较系统性的看法。相信他能够从学术的角度帮助我们深入的了解这个课题。当然，作为个人，我们也希望他能够分享自己对这个问题的观点。那介绍完了来宾之后，我们首先请沈先生做一个简短的发言。我们的来宾逐一会做一个简短的发言，之后呢，我们就开放给现场的来宾来提问。所以先请沈先生。
谢谢。今天我们在这里所讨论的跟种族关系有关的话题，其实这个不是一个新的课题，而是一个我们几十年来都在共同面对、共同关注、处理的问题。我想，只要我们还是一个多元种族的社会，有关种族的课题是永远存在的，我们永远要去面对、关注和把它处理好。所以呢，这个课题是我们一个永远要面对的问题。现在这样，以后也是如此。我是在1950年、50年代出生的。我出世的时候，那个时候新加坡还是一个英国殖民地，所以我看到了在后殖民地时代的种族关系的情况。60年代的时候，我也经历过2场种族冲突，一个是在1964年，当我们还在马来西亚的时候；另外一次是在1969年，那个时候我们已经脱离了马来西亚，但是当时马来西亚发生了513种族暴动，所以连锁反应呢也波及到新加坡。过后呢，我们独立了，我们实施了一连串的政策，朝向种族和谐的方向发展。表面上看起来呢，相安无事，一切都是平安太平，但是呢，实际上其实在全球化网络世界里，各种不同的外来的政治、社会思想和意识形态不断地冲击着世界每一个角落，包括新加坡在内的这个区域的种族关系也在发生变化。所以最近我们在接二连三发生的几起涉及到不同种族的个人的纠纷和冲突，同时还被放上这个社交媒体上广泛流传，使到这个种族问题呢又在被国人关注。所以所以在不同的声音里面， 有一些人就开始质疑说一些政策，是不是背离了我们种族和谐的这个目的？是不是助长了华人占多数的，在新加坡人口占多数的华人的所谓华人优势？甚至有一些人认为既然我们的事业里面说了我们不分种族，那么索性就把一些能够凸显甚至能够提醒人们的种族的意识的一些政策的规则和做法取消掉，所以众说纷纭。但是呢，我们从另外一个角度看，从一个比较积极的角度看，这些关系到种族的问题，能够引起国人这么强烈的反应呢，其实也是一件好事。这个显示了我们所有的人都在希望我们能够共同努力，营造一个让大家能够在一起融洽和平共处的这个环境。但是现实里呢，不同的族群因为不同的价值观念、文化背景，所以对一个同样的事情可能有不同的看法。所以呢，就这个问题呢，必须要我们碰到这个种族的问题的时候呢，这些问题应该把它放在这个台面上，大家开诚布公的交流然后呢，在一种在我们包容谅解跟相互扶持的这个原则下，我们才能够解决分歧，然后达到共识，继续在一个和谐的环境里面继续生活下去。但是呢，要达到这一点呢，首先呢，我觉得我们的国人必须要清楚的了解、意识到自己本身呢就是一个华族新加坡人、马来族新加坡人、印族新加坡人，而不是新加坡华人、新加坡马来人、新加坡印度人。因为这个华族新加坡人和新加坡华人，或者是马来族新加坡人跟新加坡马来人之间其实是有差别的。这个差别不是文字上的差别，而是意识的差别。所以我们在开诚布公讨论问题的时候呢，要清楚有这个清楚的这个意识，那么才能够就是在包容、谅解的、互相扶持的这个基础上进行。它就好像是一把能够打开彼此心门的钥匙，让我们走进一个共同的空间，以包容、谅解、互相扶持来大家彼此看问题， 然后呢大致共识。谢谢。
好，谢谢沈先生，很精彩的开场白。我想，这也是今天我们有这个对谈会的主要的原因。然后希望能够有一个包容的环境，大家能够和谐共处，我相信也是大家共同的目的。所以下来如果有机会，我们倒是可以再深入谈一下你刚才讲的马来族新加坡人和新加坡马来人，跟华族新加坡人和新加坡华人之间，到底在这种身份意识上面，它的微妙的区别是在哪里？这个不光只是我同意，不光只是一个文字游戏，就是你对个人的定义可能会影响到你看问题的视角，所以这个我觉得是很有意思的一个观点。我们下来有机会的话，可能可以多深入的探讨一下。那我们现在请我们的第二位来宾伊萨德做简短的发言。伊萨 ，please。
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really happy to be part of this very meaningful dialogue. And I would like to express my sincere thanks and appreciation to联合早报 for putting this together. I think it's a very timely opportunity for us to reflect and reimagine our shared future to build a Singapore that is peaceful, purposeful, inclusive, and resilient. Today, the world around us has evolved rapidly and changed vastly. The world is at far more risk of polarizing forces that divide rather than unite people. Globalization, as mentioned in various literature, has increased our interconnectedness with foreign cultures and communities. Social media has transformed how we communicate. Hate speech and violence in the name of personal belief and faith are on the rise. We are facing a heightened polarization of views more than ever in the context of religion, ethnic background, race, in peace building and social cohesion. We have to recognize that our social harmony is fragile and precious. Hence, we must constantly strive to protect and strengthen it. When you take race and religion, it can be very diverse in many parts of the world. However, in Singapore, we recognize that it is fundamental to our survival, prosperity, and our shared identity to ensure racial and religious harmony. But more than that, it is a testament to how we have succeeded in making our diversity a strength over the years. Our diversity is not a challenge or a weakness. Because of our different culture, beliefs, and practices, each of us is able to bring something special and make a unique contribution to the Singapore story. We have woven a beautiful tapestry from many different colored strands, and it is what defines us as Singaporean, a key to our identity. Ultimately, it is a shared commitment to build a home together. It is a home built on the ideals of multiracialism and multi-religious society, where everyone has the freedom to choose and practice his or her culture and religion. Where am I getting at in sharing about the Singapore story? Singapore, when it began before independence, you have to understand that immigrant forefathers and our forebearers first arrived in the 1820s. They naturally formed enclaves based on where they came from, or the language that they spoke, or which religion they professed. These enclaves were further entrenched by colonial rulers, who divided Singapore into ethnic residential areas. In the years leading up to our independence in 1965, we were fraught with many challenges that threatened to tear our society apart. The social bonds formed amongst people at the time were fragile. The slightest provocation or tension could incite violence or conflict, and even today, we learn about these painful lessons of the various racial riots that happened in Singapore in 1964, pre-independent and post-merger with Malaya at that time. However, we managed to overcome these challenges and nurtured a sense of community and belief in a common destiny by choosing to build a nation based on justice and equality for all. A nation where you and I are co-equals as citizens. As the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, everybody will have his place equal, religion, language, and culture. And I think it's a very important point, and what set us apart at that time from our neighboring countries. The recent racist incident has been a cause for concern, forcing us to reflect on the state of racial harmony in Singapore. In May 2021, as Minister Lawrence Wong mentioned in his speech in the IPS dialogue, a Chinese man kicked an Indian woman in the chest while uttering racial slurs. Earlier in June, a Chinese man confronted an interracial couple, saying that they should date within their respective races. A few days later, A Chinese woman was filmed hitting a gong to disrupt her Indian neighbor's prayer rituals. Most recently, a Malay lady was sentenced to jail for hurling racist insults at an Indian female commuter on a bus. These racist acts are unacceptable, and we all have a collective responsibility in tackling racism wherever it exists in our society. I think what we are lacking today, unfortunately, is unity. Forging a united people needs more than just an absence of denigration or discrimination. And more than law enforcement, while law enforcement can arguably remove hatred, it cannot fill the void with respect and empathy. A strong, cohesive society starts from tolerance and over time moves to accommodation. From accommodation, we progress to an appreciation of commonalities and differences. Finally, friendship built on goodwill, trust, and confidence in one another. And it is a process that requires continued effort and requires a lot of hard work to be put in. Allow me to also share the 4-step STAR approach that we have at Roses of Peace, the nonprofit organization which I run, where we engage in interracial and interreligious conversations. And these 4 steps include suspending judgment, where it is important to create a safe space for meaningful conversation. And I think the first step to creating safe space is to understand your preconceived stereotypes and judgments, and to learn to identify assumptions by noticing when you get upset or annoyed by something someone else is saying. You may be making an assumption. Make an effort to suspend that judgment and resume listening for understanding of each other. Second is to talk sensitively. Remember that having effective conversation on race and religion is about having a dialogue and not a debate. While you can share your perspective and deeply held beliefs, do not do so merely for the sake of argument. Take ownership of what you say, speak from your heart, which will help create an environment of honesty. Ask open-ended questions to assist your understanding and to explore assumption. And the third of the STAR is active listening. Pay attention to the conversation and take time to understand what the speaker is sharing. Active listeners avoid interrupting at all costs and summarizing and repeat back what they have heard to ensure the understanding. Use body language such as nodding, eye contact, leaning forward, that helps to build the trust and establish rapport with others. And lastly, respect opinion. You may often hear the saying, agree to disagree. However, by doing that, our differences are not engaged and instead is dismissed. Therefore, no listening, no learning actually occurs. Instead, you should allow for controversy with civility, as they say. It means that opposing views are engaged in a respectful manner, a means to learn from each other. In the context of interracial, interreligious dialogues, you'll be faced with different opinions, and that's okay. If we can respect one another for having differing opinions, thoughts, ideas, we are going to develop a better understanding by establishing a middle ground towards the end of the conversation. Every organization, be it school, place of worship, business, government, institution, play a critical role in creating environments that are psychologically safe for individuals to feel comfortable to share their views, and creating an inclusive culture where people across diverse backgrounds can express what really matters to them, including having meaningful and constructive conversation about race and religion. In conclusion, the strong community relations we enjoy today arose neither by accident nor by laws of nature. We have worked hard to enable every community to have its own space to practice its culture, its customs, and religion. Moving forward, we need to maximize our common space so that Singaporeans can live, work, play side by side in mutual respect, sharing common experiences and growing a sense of shared identity. Thank you for the opportunity.
谢谢伊萨德。他最后提出来的那4个步骤，我觉得是非常有意义的。关键我想还是在于说个人的责任。那如果要概括他那4个步骤的话，想可能最重要的就是在接触不同族群的时候，其实最重要的是出于一种真诚的好奇心，是真的是想知道说，到底是不同在哪里？这个真正的好奇心，其实就可以避免掉很多的在沟通上不必要的误会。因为出于好奇，所以你会有这种探索的精神，要去知道的更多。那很多这些负面的情绪，甚至都可以避免。不过下来如果有机会的话，我们可能可以在这方面再多讨论一些。 谢谢伊萨德。我们第3位来宾呢是文毅，那他有他就是在这方面的研究，所以我们有请文毅，谢谢。
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I must say that I'm very honored to be on this panel with a range of individuals whose achievements far outweigh mine. In my opening speech, I'd like to keep my comments isolated to the perspective of a millennial, since I have the privilege of being the youngest on this panel. So as a millennial, like many of my peers, we spend a lot of time on social media, probably way more than we should. And on social media, what I tend to observe on the topic of race, when these conversations are taking place, is that there tends to be an increasing divide between 2 different factions, right? And what I call, so the first faction is basically the group that believes that racism is not really an issue in Singapore, or that racism doesn't exist in Singapore. And the opposite faction takes the opposite view, of course. They believe that racism is the only only issue that matters in Singapore, right? And what we see is 2 warring factions that aren't really interested to speak to one another, who aren't really interested to listen to one another, and there's a lot of political showboating going on, and I think that is very, very unhealthy for the discourse on race when both sides actually claim to be for the minorities that they claim to be care and speak about, right? So the first group, the one that believes that racism is not that big an issue in Singapore, I've seen outrageous comments made by these groups, right, where they say things like, oh, racism doesn't exist, or the PAP has solved racism. And when I see these types of comments, I'm just, it's just shocking, right? Because we can grunt that, yes, Singapore does do much better on racial relations compared to many of our neighbors, or around the world even. But here's the point to take. No amount of policy intervention can eliminate racist attitudes in Singapore, right? And as long as we live in a relatively free society where people are free to socialize and trade, we will need to always encounter people who hold deeply racist attitudes, and to find ways to correct that and to persuade them and to show them the other side of the story, right? And I think that to me is the point that the first camp misses, right? And they need to have a little bit more empathy about the kinds of disadvantages that the minorities face, and not just along the dimensions of race, right? Majorities of all dimensions have an advantage in societies, whether you are the racial majority, whether you are omnivore, you're not vegetarian, whether you're a right-hander over a left-hander, right? And I think the kinds of disadvantages that minorities face tend to be glossed over by this first camp, and I think that's what we need to work on, right? Is to highlight the problems that minorities face and show it to them. And that takes me to the other side of the coin, the second camp, which is the camp that believes that racism is the only issue that matters in Singapore. And I'm summarizing a little bit, but what essentially the sort of approximation of the people in this camp is that every social ill in society can be analyzed through the lens of race. Everything can be boiled down to racial conflict, and I think that view is just as wrong, right? And they tend to throw around the term institutional racism a lot, right, or systemic racism. And I mean, just to give a little bit of perspective, when I think of the term systemic racism, I'm thinking of, look across the causeway, right? Look at Malaysia, where you have policies that truly deeply disadvantage the racial minorities, the Chinese and the Indians, right? You look at, say, China, where the political and education system is set up in a way that privileges Han Chinese culture. Look at what's happening in the last year in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, right? And there's so many more examples, right? India, Sri Lanka, and I can go on and on and on. But when I think of systemic racism, I look at Singapore and I don't see systemic problems on that level. And then, of course, that's not to say that our policies are perfect. Of course, we need to keep working at it and keep re-evaluating it. But when I hear terms like grandiose terms like systemic racism, I agree very much with them that racism is a problem that needs to be addressed in Singapore. But when I hear terms like that, that's where I get off the boat, right? Because you're turning up the moralism when what we need is less of it. You're turning up the political showboating, and when what we need is more common ground, right? We need to find common ground with people who disagree with one another. And I think this is what the second camp misses. So in closing, for my opening remarks, I think the short takeaway is that try to avoid taking sides, especially on issues, very sensitive issues like race, right? The more you take sides, the more you're blinded to the legitimate grievances that the other side has. It's not a football game. I'm not a Manchester United fan and you're an Arsenal fan, so we don't have to go at it this way. What we need to try and do is to find common ground where we can agree on and have the kinds of productive and sane discussions that might develop policies that might actually address these problems. And I think as we go into this topic, I think that's what everyone needs to do to try and untangle this very sensitive issue. Thank you.
谢谢文毅。我非常赞同你的观点，就是说我们在讨论这个种族课题的时候，目的其实是要促进了解，就是看能不能够减少就是不同种族之间的误会，而不是把它当作是一场道德博弈，就是证明我是对的，对方是错的。无论站在哪一个极端的立场，我觉得都是很片面的，也不利于我们在探讨这些种族课题。不过我就让我联想到今天早上起来读报的时候，我很高兴的看到一则报道，就是之前那个讲师就是在街上公然的去质疑一对跨族伴侣的那位讲师，已经通过他的律师公开道歉了。他甚至为此而去开了一个社交媒体账户，为了要让更多人知道他道歉。我觉得这个是一个比较积极的发展，就是说在碰到这些我们知道并且认为是错的事情的时候，我们要让越多的人知道这个是错的，就是非还是有的。但是在探讨不同的时候，我觉得就不应该采取那种道德的立场，我觉得这点是非常重要的。谢谢文毅。那下来我们请伯乐发言，谢谢。
Hi, thanks. I also want to thank everyone at Zaopao for inviting me to come and share. I know you introduced me as the Executive Director of Migrant Worker Center, but I think the key reason for me being part of this panel is because of my own ethnicity, ethnic makeup, what have you. And I want to first say that a lot of what I say today is going to be as a result of my own personal lived experiences throughout my life. I've shared some photographs, and I understand that Zaopao will be sharing this with everybody online. Of my family, so everyone you see in the photographs will be members of my family, my wife, my kids, my cousins, my uncles and aunties, my parents' generation. And I think the reason why I wanted to share all this with everyone is to basically let everybody know that where I come from, we actually take a lot of pride in the areas where we are different. We celebrate our differences. We're probably the poster family for multiculturalism, multiracialism, even multi-religions. And as I grew up in this environment, to me, race and religion, the differences really never mattered, never came up in conversations. It was never something you would talk about with your cousins, your siblings, your uncles and aunties. And we were, we simply put, we just loved each other for who everyone was. And I think in that way, there is some consistency with you know, what Singapore has managed to achieve over these years, in fact, these 50 or so years. It's a similar project. It's something where I think ultimately we hope to appeal to greater ideals, where we come together and in a way meld together all our different strengths, all our different advantages and good points. And we find ways while we are doing this to emphasize our positive attributes, to talk about, deal with, understand, tolerate, accept, and work through, you know, where perhaps we are not so advantageous or attributes are not so positive. So I see my family a little bit like a microcosm of the Singapore story. Personally, myself, as I began to go to school and then started working, to be fair, as an Indian Chinese Singaporean, I'm possibly what you would call a minority within a minority. While I'm registered, you know, in the IC as an Indian, the downside to my own ethnic makeup was sometimes I couldn't fit even within Indian communities. And then sometimes the same would happen maybe with Chinese communities. And, you know, even though the number has increased of late, round about the time I was going to school, it was really not very common to find people of exactly the same ethnic mix as me. So that was the downside. There were times when I felt maybe a little bit isolated, and obviously there were instances where I felt that was a little bit insensitive, you know, and things like that. But being a minority within a minority, I'd be honest to say that there maybe were times I was afraid to speak up, because then I would be very, very different. But I think over the years this has changed. I think especially the youth, young Singaporeans today are so very much more open in the way they view things and in the way they get access to news and what is happening overseas, and they are a lot more open to sitting down and discussing things, and in the way that maybe Arshad had raised earlier on, suspending judgment, trying to remove the emotion from the discussion, you know, and being honest, and really with a spirit of wanting to learn and wanting to understand. So I think, given that I've seen this among our youth, I think the future is positive, and it depends on what we now do with it. But back to when I was growing up, I also saw some plus sides to being how I am. I kind of offered my Chinese friends that perhaps wanted to know more about Indian culture, or my Indian friends who perhaps wanted to understand more about Chinese culture, I kind of offered them a middle ground. I represented the guy that, you know, you could ask quietly, and he may not get offended, and he may want to explain and help you along. And I have to say that the instances where I had experienced insensitivities were compared to these instances where I encountered people that wanted to learn and honestly wanted to understand. It was this latter group that was much, much more. It outnumbered those instances where people were insensitive. And so, to me personally, I felt, wow, you know, if so many more people want to understand and perhaps want to use me as a vehicle or a channel to understand, then I think it's incumbent upon me to help enhance this understanding. So when I was younger, there were many, many instances, and if you had contact with any of my family, you could ask them this. There are many, many instances where, just as a as a means to help heighten understanding, I'd bring everybody to our house. And then, Chinese and Indian friends would come at the same time, and they would realize that, on the dinner table, you had a curry and you had a soup. And, you had this mix of all these things, which people wonder because they would ask me questions. What do you eat at home? What language do you speak to each of your parents? And I felt that a lot of this, if maybe voiced the wrong way or articulated the wrong way, could have the potential to hurt someone. But after some time, I realized that a very, very important point to when these questions are posed to you, or when someone says something like this, we've got to look for the intention behind the question. If the intention was to understand, to learn, and therefore be more able to accept, tolerate, I would always try to help, for the purpose of enhancing understanding overall. Very rarely, I must reflect my own experience, was the intention behind the question malicious, or with the intention to cause hurt or pain. So I think that's our experience. For a family like mine, regardless of race, is not something you say every morning at assembly. It is existential. It is our solace, our comfort. It is what lets us know we are Singaporean. And so that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
好的，非常谢谢伯乐。他刚才提到就是说，他分享个人的这个家庭的经验，然后我觉得一个点很重要，就是可能等一下跟少师可能会有更多的想法。就刚才我们在台下私底下聊的时候，就作为受害方吧，就是可能对方说的是言者无心，他可能没有意识到自己的这种不敏感的地方。我要说的主要就是说，在讨论种族问题的时候，虽然我们必须用一种理性的态度去讨论，但是我们同时也很难避免有这个情绪的成分。要怎么去超越跟克服这个情绪的成分，我觉得是要真的是开诚布公在谈的时候，我们都同意要包容、要和谐、要融洽，但是我们也同时不能否认，确实很多时候出现这种种族误会的时候，那个负面情绪是真实存在的，特别是在受的那一方。所以这个点如果下面有机会的话，或许我们也不妨再探讨一下。那下来我们有请少师做一个简短的发言，谢谢。
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to 联合早报 for inviting me to be part of this panel alongside my fellow panelists. Okay, because I was told that we're only given like about 5 minutes. I'm not a fast talker, so
there's some leeway.
So I will rely a little bit more on what I've written here. I will mostly talk about what I've prepared beforehand, right? Instead of responding to our panelists, which maybe that can come later. Okay, so I think given for the fact that for the past weeks, right, many of our newspapers, including the Straits Times,早报, of course, today, have done special features on the topic of racism and ethnic relations. I think I had some thinking about how, I could make this 5 minutes a bit more constructive and not repeat, views and opinions. So I think I would like to focus on perhaps 3 key points of tensions that I see, that perhaps we have to all work through, right, in order to advance in the conversation and in ethnic relations. Okay, so the very first one is language/terminology, okay, versus lived experiences, right? Because I think there has been some discussions, or even like what Arshad calls debates, right, over terminology quite a bit, and like, critical race theory over like concept of Chinese privilege, so on and so forth, whether such Western importation are relevant to Singapore, right, so on and so forth. So as a researcher, I do think that these are important discussions, right, because they can allow us to explore complexities, explore connections, draw parallels, and maybe even enable clarifications of ideas and facilitate like common grounds of exchanges. But at times, I think sometimes the conceptual debates takes precedence over lived experiences, which then, push it, towards the back seat, and that's get lost, right? So I think we need to try to bring some of these lived experiences back, and I think we need to reach out to as many people as possible, okay? Because I think Singapore is very, very much more diverse than sometimes we, recognize. Also, there's an observable differential access to theories and concepts amongst different sectors of the population. So if you want to draw them in to the conversation, I think it's easier to talk about stories, about lived experiences, rather than, some abstract concepts which they may need some time, right, to grapple with. Yeah, so that's one. And for number two, that is perhaps more directed towards the concept Chinese privilege, okay, is the two perspectives, right? One is naming the phenomenon, right, versus racializing, right? So naming, right, I see two different perspectives. So one is supportive of it, right? As I mentioned in an earlier dialogue that Zaobao has published earlier this week, some people believe that Chinese privilege does give the minorities, a language or a vocabulary, right, to explore the experiences they've been through, okay, especially those who have experienced negative bullying or, something to that sort. So they feel that it gives them the vocab to articulate and describe, right, what they have been through. So for them, it would appear that they experienced such circumstances because they are not Chinese, right? So for them, it's very commonsensical then, right, to use the term Chinese privilege, right? Because if you are Chinese, the likelihood is that you may not need to experience some of these things that they experience, okay? So, but the other perspective, of course, is that some of the Chinese-speaking older generation especially would feel very baffled, okay, by Chinese privilege, because previously they also had this, what they see as a stigma, Chinese chauvinism, right, associated with them. They saw it as a historical term, but Chinese privilege sort of comes in to reignite that kind of negative, memories that they have. And so, and they see Chinese and chauvinism being placed together, and now it's Chinese and privilege. So there is some kind of like racialization going on, which I think many people usually don't like, your ethnic group to be attached to any label that is that would be deemed, stigmatization. So this then brings us to this question: and how do we continue to keep the lines of engagement open with them? Yeah, so this is something that I myself I'm grappling with as well. Yeah, and also of course, like, when some people talk about, racialization that has been taking place in Singapore, because we often use these racial categories, right, in various aspects of life. So how do we get away from that if we think that that is something that you want to, work towards to getting a common ground? Okay, so then this brings me to the last point, third one, which is also very much related to maybe what some of my panelists have spoken about: conversations, forging understanding, so on and so forth. Okay, this is the tension between, say, being constructive and versus being comfortable, right? Definitely, yes, we need to have a safe space, and I think Arshad mentioned that just now, right, for discussing sensitive issues and all this, okay? And I think in our society, we see a dominant approach to harmony, which is that of conflict avoidance, right? We think that we don't go near, right, to something that would potentially put us in a position where we could come into, direct confrontation or so something more severe, right? When we are talking about our views. So if you want to move from that, to talking about what we think needs to be talked about, which is why I think we are here today, right? Whether it's racism or ethnic relations, how do we even make that shift? Can we remain comfortable with new changes, right? So this is something which is, I think we might need to think about is, can we allow some degree of discomfort? But it's constructive discomfort, all right? Not destructive discomfort. And that discomfort could be something that we ourselves have to deal with as we manage a new scenario, as we manage, our own struggles within ourselves or within how people see us, right? And somehow work through that. And this is also partly from my own experience working with different people as part of my research work. Yeah, so I think these three tensions, right, I think we need to take time to work it through, otherwise we might fall into the risk of maybe what Donovan mentioned just now, the kind of polarization, that tears us apart. Right, so I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
好，谢谢邵师。我非常同意，就是说，在讨论像种族课题这种敏感话题的时候，过程当中肯定会有不舒服的感觉，因为其实道理也很简单，就是任何需要解决的问题，它一定是困难的。然后你真的要去面对它的话，那个过程肯定是不舒服的。打一个很不恰当的比方，就是我跟我太太有时候也会有一些床头打架、床尾和的事件，但是你如果是故意为了避免说起冲突而不去面对它、不去沟通、不去交谈的话，它其实是会让那种不舒服、不满的情绪压抑着，而没有真正去消除。所以你真正必须要拿到台面上来沟通，经历那种不舒服的过程，才有可能真正得到一个沟通的目的跟一个谅解。因为我必须要跟他生活一辈子，就像我们不同的族群的人要共同在这块土地上生存世世代代一样。所以面对这种不舒服，我觉得是一个必须要付出的代价。当然我们不是要那种不舒服演变为一种公开的不可妥协的冲突，但是我觉得这个点是很好的，就是不舒服并不代表就是不好，它可能是一个我们必须要付出的代价。那非常谢谢邵师以及各位分享你们的观点。接下来是我们的提问时间。在提问之前，我其实自己也准备了3道问题，我先看一看我们现场的来宾有问题在陆续进来。我看我先抛砖引玉，把我已经准备好的问题提呈给各位来探讨。那虽然我的问题可能是针对个别人，但是我也欢迎各位嘉宾随时，如果你们有自己的观点，也可以针对同一个问题发表你们的看法。那首先可能先请教沈先生，因为刚才你提到一个很有趣的观点，就是我们不可能在讨论这个种族课题的时候，不可能不有这个时间的纵深，就是你要有这个历史感，因为好像我们现在看这个问题，如果我们不知道过去发生了什么事情，其实我们对于整个问题的理解是很片面的。那你经历过这种建国以来的种族的这种冲突、种族关系的演变，那我不应该问说现在是变好了还是变坏了，我觉得这样问可能太简单。就是说，你觉得从这几十年的发展下来，新加坡的种族关系它有经历了什么变化，有什么不同？然后你觉得它正在朝着怎么样的一个方向发展？你自己的体会是如何的？
我在这个小岛上生活了超过半个世纪，其实差不多快要3/4世纪了。我在50年代的时候 生的时候，那个时候还是一个英殖民地时代，然后到现在，所以我可以看得到，在这一个时间段里边的这个种族关系的不同，今天的种族关系和50、60年代的时候的种族关系有什么变化不同？主要呢原因会有不同的原因，是因为时间变了，环境改变了，世界的环境改变，我们的社会的环境也改变了，所以就造成了这一些不同。而50年代出世的时候，我出世的地点是在新加坡河畔，就是现在爱尔金桥跟哥里门桥之间的那一段新加坡最繁忙的新加坡河最繁忙的那一段，也就是现在水仙门大厦 High Street Center 那一个地点，国会大厦旁边，那个地区呢，主要呢居住的都是华人，而我的外祖父是住在樟宜的一个马来乡村，他在第2次世界大战之前呢，就来到这里，然后在那个马来乡村开了一间杂货店，所以他也会讲马来话。然后我呢，一年会在那边住上2个月，因为那个时候的学校假期很长，我年终假期住1个月，尾假期上去住1个月，所以呢，我是在同时在一个华人的社区里边，跟一个马来社区里面长大的，所以我可以看得到当时的整个这个种族关系的情况。那个时候的种族关系一般上都是相当融洽的。原因是什么？原因是因为我们都是各离的。因为你想在马来乡村里面，住在马来乡村里面的人，不管是华人、马来人，他们可能几年都没有下坡一次，没有到社区一次。然后住在社区的人，也可能几年也没有到过马来乡村，因为那个时候的那个交通也不发达。如果我不是因为我外祖父在马来乡村，我不可能上去，而且是每个2个星期就上去一次，因为我父亲带我上去，因为那个时候没有电话。没有电话的时候呢，我妈又住在我家，我外祖父家，我们上去一趟就要花上2、3个钟头的时间，所以在那种情况之下呢，那个信息沟通没有这样，跟现在不一样。现在的网络世界，你坐在这边的话，我看到处哪里发生的事情，其实我一个手机里面我马上就会知道，所以当时是这样的一个情景。但是融洽的这个种族关系很容易，因为刚才我们讲到的这个是一个情绪的问题，很容易一点火，一个火花就会燃烧起来。所以在60年代的时候，1964年的时候，我们发生了一次种族暴动。那个时候，因为我们在马来西亚里面，马来西亚联邦，当时新加坡地方政府的对于种族的政策，跟 马来西亚中央政府是完全不同的，是相左的。所以呢，也就是为什么我们会被请出马来西亚的原因。因为政客的本身的这些政治需要，所以使到就是在点火后来呢，就1964年终于就爆发了一场非常严重的这个种族冲突。69年我们脱离以后呢，因为马来西亚继续发生了513的事件，我们也被波及。就在那个1964年的那个时候，因为我刚才说我每个星期2个星期就上去一次，有一个星期我上去了，结果我的祖父告诉我，他说：“哇，幸运啊，我们差点就卷入了一个就是这个种族在那个乡村里面发生了一个就是种族那个暴动，而那一场暴动刚好呢，我外祖父在场，所以他就阻止跟化解了这一场这个暴动。因为当时我们住在乡村里面是没有自来水的，只有公共水喉，所以每天呢，我们都要到公共水喉去挑水回家煮熟它回家用。那么我祖父因为一个公共水喉很多人用，早上的非常繁忙，他就没去。但时常是在中午以后，他才拿了水桶、便当到那个公共水喉去挑水。刚好那天是星期天，他就不是星期五，我星期天去。他告诉我那天星期五，在他挑水的时候，忽然间看到一群年轻的马来族的村民，绑着头巾，打着红帮鼓，拿着8人刀，就要过去桥另外一端华人居住比较多的那个村落要去厮杀。我祖父呢，就刚好被他在水龙头看到，他结果呢拿了他的那个扁担，一个人站在那个桥上，阻止他们过去。那么那个是因为我祖父在战前就在那边生活，所以他们也非常尊重他，也尊敬他，所以不敢妄动。所以那一场冲突没有爆发，因为呢，有村民就跑回去村里，告诉了这个马来族的这个地方的领袖，所以他跑到这个现场，阻止了那一场暴动。那2个其实这个马来领袖的2个儿子还在那一群年轻人里边，所以你看多么危险。虽然你看起来表面上很平安无事，但是呢，一个小火花就能够把它烧起来。我还记得我祖父讲过一句话，他说那个事件发生了以后，每一天晚上他们都轮流守夜，因为他告诉我，他说村里没有问题的，他相信我们村里没有问题，但是他怕的是外来的，可能是别个村落的人混进来，或者是 可能是别一个州，那个时候我们在联邦里边，一混进来的话，就糟糕了。所以他们每晚都要这个在守夜。所以那天是星期天，它发生在星期五。星期五了以后，很多马来村民就做了马来糕点送到我们家。所以我星期天去的时候，我还有口福，我还有的吃。所以你看这个所以不管是什么族群的人，我相信我们生活在这个土地上呢，大家都是希望说我们能够在一个和谐的这个环境里面生活。然后呢，在脱离了以后，我们朝着种族和谐的这个方向发展。但是今天呢，在这个网络世界里面呢，信息的那个流通使到我们现在的整个环境也改变了。我在1992年的时候，那个是90年代，1992年的时候，我离开了我服务了14年的银行界，跟几个朋友从事这个贸易生意。我们有一个这个津巴布韦的顾客，我到津巴布韦去观察，因为那个时候然后我们去到南非，在南非的时候，那个时候是第一次海湾战争刚刚结束。我到了南非时候，我见了这个商家，我们谈生意。我跟另外一个同事一起去，他是一个印度回教徒。当我们在谈生意的时候，我发现南非的这个商家，他兴趣的不是生意，而是跟我一起去的这个印度回教同胞，因为他一直在跟他灌输他的宗教思想。那个时候，萨达姆胡塞是他们的英雄，所以他把他的很多那些刊物都介绍给我的这个同事看。我不会看，因为都是扰译文。但是呢，我可以看到那些图片，很多都是蒙着脸，只是露出一双眼睛的提着刀枪的那个战士。我当时看得很怕，因为我在想，我们我们家里的这个种族情况都不是这样的，不是这么这个激进。但是呢，我那个时候就是唯一可以安心的，就是说，我说，这个东西是发生在我居住的地球的另外一端，不是我们离我们还很远。但是呢，10年后，第一个炸弹在印尼加大爆发，然后接下去的话，我们就可以看到就是巴厘岛的爆炸等等之类。然后你看 还有很多这些激进的这个案例，自我激进化的案例在发生。1992年我会这样想，是因为那个时候连电邮都没有，那个通讯还不发达。但是现在的情况不同，现在呢不只有电邮，还有这个网络，而且这些社交平台呢，你在这个这个有一些是公开的，可以看得到的，但是也有隐秘的，很多可以就是在这个好像 WhatsApp 之类的这个比较隐秘的私聊的那个里边沟通，所以很多这个不确实的信息不一定能够及时被纠正，所以现在呢，我们是处在一个跟50年代、60年代很不相同的这个世界跟社会环境。
好，谢谢沈先生。我们陆续收到了一些提问，其中有一题其实跟我准备的第二题有一些接近的，所以可能我连着一起问。第二题其实主要是要问我们2位非华族的嘉宾，就是因为我们在读早报的时候，其实有这样普遍的一个印象，就是有一些早报读者他不认为新加坡存在严重的这个种族歧视的问题。那么作为非华族，你们2位在日常生活中可能有自己不一样的体验。那么是不是能够请2位分享自己的这种生活上的遭遇，然后就是从你们的角度说一些可能新加坡华人大部分的华人可能没有意识到的一个现象。那我们线上的来宾当中有一位就问，这个可能是针对每一位嘉宾，就是说我们在讨论所谓的种族歧视 racism 的时候，或者是种族主义，是不是能够有一个清晰的定义？到底我们所谓的种族主义或者是种族歧视是什么？所以我先请2位伯乐跟伊萨德先发言，然后顺便也回答这个问题，好吗？
Thank you so much. I think it's a very important question that's being raised, which is how do you define racism? And frankly, I've come across many definitions of various people interpreting what the meaning is, and personally, I don't have a clear understanding of how do you define racism. And I think we can collectively discuss this in various forums to land on a common consensus as a Singaporean. How do we define racism? Where do we put the line and say, this is where the boundaries are, we can't cross it. So I think it has to be collectively defined, and I hope that in future sessions, be it SAPA or various organizations, we can come together, and even academics can chime in to see not just from academic perspective, but also with practitioners on the ground, with policymakers, how can we define what racism is, and where do we draw the parameters and the OB markers such that we're able to have a common understanding that exists. To your question on do racism exist in Singapore, I think I've had some experiences. It can be very simple experience, but it leaves a mark or impression. And I can share some of the stories that have been narrated to me over the years from my peers, from our members and youth whom we have engaged at Rose of Peace. Just a simple one, for example, one of our ROP ambassadors, she recounted how when she was growing up in primary school, how small kids, we have to pair up, in twos and then, go to the canteen or from the class, we have to go and, walk through together. And she said that, she's an Indian, and she said she was paired up with a Chinese girl, and she refused to hold her hand because, hey, you're Indian. And, I don't want to hold your hand, and, I think the teacher had to intervene at that point to, pair her with someone else. But that left a mark on her, and she's now in her late 20s, and from primary school, when she was probably 7 or 8, till today, she remembers that very vividly, and it affected her. Another instance, We had our Rose of Peace ambassador, we distribute roses with messages of peace and harmony to the larger public. And she is a Malay girl and she wears a tudung. And when she went out in the public, and we are distributing roses, and we're not asking for money or anything, but we are sharing the message of peace and harmony. And she went to give that rose to, a person, and the person, based on her race or her, visible clothing that she was wearing, which was wearing a tudung, refused to take the rose from her, and instead went to another person of the same ethnicity to take the rose from the other person, and to speak and interact with the person. Personally, for me, I've had an instance where I got on a lift, and a person, as an Indian, I was a bit taken aback being a Singaporean, because I've never been in that situation where this person was a Chinese lady. She got off the lift because I got on it. And this was during the time when, during my tenure and term as a nominated member of parliament. And there I was in parliament defending about, racism and, these incidents, and speaking on bills on POFMA and how, we have to be very sensitive towards building racial cohesion and, religious harmony and so on. And there I am facing this instance. Even though it's simple, not that complicated. I get on a lift and the person get off. It's not to say that, people can say it's not racist and the person just wants to get off, but you can see the person stare at you, look at you, and feel a bit, unsettled because you just got on the lift and you are from a different race, possibly I'm an Indian, and then, the interaction and the eye contact is what matters. And that I could see that, she was not comfortable, and I could have just said that it's okay, you can stay on the lift, I can take the escalator down, but she moved before I could even interact or to hold a conversation with her. I think these are incidents where I've been in, and as well as I've heard and interacted with people where they narrated that they feel uncomfortable, and they were quite taken aback. And in some instances, I can share with you, people can't even process what just happened. People are not able to even, really come to terms with, what they just experienced, because this is not an experience which you're used to. By and large in Singapore, we live in, peace and harmony. We have friends from various religion, from various ethnicity, and you're not used to this kind of, interaction. And it's an anomaly, but it's an anomaly that's, impactful enough for these people to remember, for many years to come. And I think we can definitely do better. And I think in this circumstance, as what Bernard was alluding to earlier, understand the intent behind it. And I think the understanding of the intent can only come when you're able to sit down, process, rationalize, and to be able to, give them the benefit of the doubt. But in some circumstances, when people are moved by emotions, when people are moved by, just taken aback and in the whole moment, they're not able to do that. They're not able to rationalize or understand or give them the benefit of the doubt, and hence they react. And that's why I was, earlier in my sharing, I was saying that I think one of the key approach to take would be to suspend judgments. And I think it's important to do that, and to put yourself in the other person's shoe before you act in a certain way, and to see how they may feel or how you may feel if you are in that position. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
好的，谢谢。伯乐要分享你的故事吗？
可以，我试一下。If you say to define, I think I agree with Arshad. I think maybe a little bit unfair to pose the question to us and say, what is racism? Because
这个问题是问所有的人。
to be very honest, I feel it is something we should define collectively, including, where the red lines are, where the danger points are. And this comes with basically framing the ground rules of the conversation that we say we all want to have. And because we want to have a safe conversation, we need to first set these, OB markers, as Arshad says. And in so doing, we then, actually I'm not so sure whether we will ever come up with a a complete or comprehensive definition of what is racism. I think environmental factors also affect our definition, and as we all know, environmental factors change. So maybe what we're looking for is a definition that continues to evolve and to move. And the only way to even get near to the definition is to just keep talking to each other and heightening understanding as far as we possibly can. If you ask me about whether personally I've experienced racism, I first want to say that I think I'm older than Urshad Donovan, maybe not as old as Mr. Sim, but I feel my generation still, in a way, was very much in awe of the word racism. So the moment you say racism, right, all the alarm bells go off. I still personally don't feel comfortable with casual racism, because I feel you're trying to place an adjective before racism to make it not sound bad. So I'd rather say, have I been on the negative end of people's prejudices, biases, discrimination, things like that. And obviously, if I said no, no one would believe me anyway. So I have stories that, quite hurtful. I'd rather not share these. These are along the lines of what Urshad shared about the girl who couldn't find someone to hold her hand. That kind of thing that can really have quite long-term effects on the self-esteem of the minority child. But I also have some funny anecdotes, and one of which was, and this is to say, I think it's one of those instances where we think of the intention, and there was no negative intention, right? But what turned out was really quite amusing, because I have always done Chinese as a second language, and that confuses some people. So when I went to junior college, the very first day of, must have been the first day of school or the second day of school, but it was our first Chinese class. And it was a situation, and nothing against this Chinese teacher of mine. She eventually became one of my most favorite teachers, right? But on the first day, she refused to carry on with the class until those in the class, including myself, of course, that were not taking Chinese, left to go for their own mother tongue classes. So she came with the assumption that, looking like how I look, I'm definitely not taking Mandarin, so I would have to please leave before she can proceed with her class. And I think as she began to realize that, actually no, he's taking Mandarin, it was not only amusing to the class, not only amusing to me, it was amusing to her also. But I tell this story because immediately after she realized, she went out of her way to apologize and to make me feel comfortable within the class. And I thought that was very, very kind of her, and she wouldn't have had to do it, but she still went ahead to do it. And I thought that was, it's something that when it comes to prejudice, discrimination, and things like that, when you go through incidents like this, it has the effect of re-energizing you or reinvigorating you, as a minority seeking to find his way, maybe in a majority space. So that's one experience I would share. I would say that all minorities probably experience some level of prejudice, discrimination on account of their race, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that Mr. Sim has told all the stories. We've made a lot of effort over the years, to make Singapore, in a way, very different from everywhere else. And personally, I truly believe that we have come a long way. From time to time, we will still get these instances like we've seen in social media in recent months and things like that. But I think the acid test for us as a society is how we manage these incidents, how, if it is necessary, action is taken on people that, perhaps do not share our ideals, and our aspirations. And then from there, how we open up the conversation, how we are more willing to talk to each other, to understand, and to continue with this, what I think is a very worthwhile project.
好的，谢谢。我基本上同意你的看法，就是说要对所谓的种族主义 racism 下一个定义，确实是非常不容易的一件事情。这让我联想到，好像在美国有一个法官在判刑的时候说，到底什么是色情片 pornography？ 他说你看到的时候你就会知道了，但是你很难去定义，给一个完整的定义似乎是不容易的。就像那个理工学院的讲师的那个行为。大家一看，为什么他会成为过街老鼠？因为大家一看，马上就知道说这就是种族歧视，这个就是不对的。但是你说真的是要下一个定义的话，恐怕确实不是那么的容易。那他最后他自己也意识到说他不对的，所以他还要通过律师开设一个社交媒体账号，向全社会道歉。这个是我觉得比较欣慰的，就是他也意识到说这个是不对的。我想可能在处理这个问题或者在对待这个问题的时候，就是什么是种族主义，什么不是种族主义，但是却是不应该有的，可能是出于无知，可能是出于不够敏感。这个中间那条线要怎么画，确实是不容易。但是我觉得提高大家的意识，让大家尽可能的不要就算是无意的，也不要去冒犯来自不同文化背景的人，来自不同种族背景的人。我觉得这个提高这个意识本身确实是有它的作用的。那我的第三个问题结合刚才就是怎么去定义，或许另外两位就是从研究员的角度，从学术的角度可能有他们的看法，但是我想结合就请他们文艺跟这个邵师同时也就是对最近这些发生的这些不同种族之间的这种冲突或者是矛盾，有人认为他们是孤立的事件，但是也有人担心说，这个是不是一种潜在的种族歧视？结合说你们怎么看待、怎么定义种族歧视？是不是背后还有其他比较深层的原因？看哪一位要先来？邵师先来。
Sting. Yeah. If I may share my some findings from a study, right, that me and my team have conducted on secondary school students, how they navigate diversities. Some of the findings I've shared earlier on in Zaopa, but that's more like, in Mandarin, so now I'll share it in English. You asked whether it's racism is isolated. What we see recently is isolated events, right? But from our findings, we do see a lot more minorities than majority reporting incidents of, racist bullying or passing on like racial remarks. Okay, they may not call it racism because perhaps we are not accustomed, right, to the discussion of racism, what it means and all that. But when we ask them, have you heard of name calling? Have you been caught by something you think you dislike or that hurts you, right? So for the Chinese students, local Chinese students, you hardly hear any complaints. But we have, I think, most of the incidents targeting, especially at the appearance of the Indian Singaporeans. And you can see that majority-minority asymmetry here, right? Because Chinese being 75%, they are seen as the norm, or they see themselves as the norm because they see more of themselves around in that sense. So I don't think this is isolated events, but in terms of, because there is such a norm, there's this majority privilege. If we don't intervene, if we don't see that as a structural issue in terms of how demographic-wise, Chinese privilege could, the majority privilege could mean that the norms is set in a particular way, then if we don't recognize that, then it's hard to tackle racism, if you like. But I also see confusion, I also see ambiguity, right, in the way they talk about certain encounters. So I think like Arshad said earlier on how some of them, right, maybe at that time when they faced it, they're not sure how to deal with it. Very often, I think our young students, they will say that they either walk away, right, because they don't want to sound like they are the they are the troublemaker, they like everyone's joking, but they are like, taking it too seriously, that kind of thing. And then we also get a few students who, at a later stage, because we talk to them in focus group discussions, but we also talk to them at individual interviews, right? And a couple of them, upon closer probing, right, they would say, well, actually, I'm not exactly comfortable. Right, so again, you see, right, I think that we need some kind of common grounds in discussing, where the boundaries are, right, and many of them think they can control the boundaries, because they think that, as long as we are friends, it's okay, right, but you do see, I don't want to make it sound too serious, because, I mean, like, jokes and all that is quite common among friends, right? But where is the line drawn? Like, do you have to check whether the other person is comfortable before, you go on a bit too far? I think things like this might have been discussed. Yeah, thank you.
Wenyi,
I agree with a lot of what you were just saying. I think more than anything, it's this notion that people are afraid to speak up because they want to avoid like the topics of race, right? I think that's a tragedy, because to address any problem, right, whether it's race, whether it's in the family unit, whether it's at your office, you need to be able to speak about it honestly and frankly, right? And when people are harsh over it, over time, what you tend to see to happen is that these problems get swept under the rug and it doesn't get addressed. And so the question is, why is that the case, right? Why is it that people are becoming more and more afraid to speak about race? And I think it ties back to the earlier points that I was making during my opening remarks, right? Which is that we live in a climate where, okay, let me isolate my comments to Singapore, right? When I look on social media on Singapore, what I tend to see is that whenever the topic of race is brought up, one of two things is happening. The first, someone is trying to manufacture outrage based on some new viral clip that's circulating on the internet, right? The second thing that's happening is someone is trying to undermine whatever mistake that the government made in some specific policy, right? So when the most active participants in the discussion, when what they are trying to do is to like wait for you to slip up and then undermine you and make a fool out of you, then it's very natural that people are going to avoid the topic of race, right? Why would I want to participate in a topic if I might potentially slip up and be made a fool out of, right? Imagine if I was working in an office and my colleague found my mistake, and instead of coming to me personally, he decided to CC the entire office and air my mistake, and he say, hey, look, Donovan did something wrong. So then, I think it creates a very hostile climate, obviously, right? Let me circle back a few steps, right, to my to more of like a macro view. So, when I look at racism in Singapore, I assess it on two levels, right? The macro and the micro level. The good news is that on the macro level, Singapore is doing quite well, I would say, relatively well. And there are many ways we might be able to measure this, right? Anecdotally, we can see that racial conflicts and deep-seated conflicts are absent. we might look at, say, studies like the World Value Survey or like the Legatum Prosperity Indexes that try to speak to people who live in these countries and ask, how do you feel as a minority living in your country? And Singapore tends to come up right at the top, next to Switzerland, next to the Scandinavian countries, right? And that's a good thing because at least we're doing well on the macro level, right? And I think that's is testament to the fact that Singapore has come a very long way from the 1960s where we had active riots. And I think that's something we should, number one, celebrate, and number two, look at what we have done right so we can replicate more of what we have already done. Now, if I pause right here, and this video was uploaded somewhere, I have no doubt that someone on the site who believes that racism is not really a big issue in Singapore is going to take what I just said and basically affirm whatever he believes in, right? That just say that, hey, look, he's right. Racism is not a big issue. Let's talk about something else. And to that person, I would say that if you take this type of like one-sided view where you're just looking to affirm your own preconceived notions, then I think you're part of the problem. You're not contributing to the solution, right? So building on your research on like racial biases that exist in the education system, I can share a very quick anecdote of when I was a university student not too long ago. University students have to get into groups and do their project works, right? So I remember distinctly, there was once when I had to form a group, and of course, you always have your close buddies in school, and one of my buddies, we were looking for like 2 other members, right? And they basically said something to the effect of, let's not pick that Malay guy or that Indian guy, right? And you see, the point that I'm trying to make is that as a racial majority, you will always be able to go out in the world and engage the world in a way where you will never have to worry about small little things that racial minorities might have to worry about, right? In Singapore, I will never have to worry about being called, say, for example, a chink. When I lived in Europe for a year, I did encounter certain experiences like that. And you see, the point is that as the majority group, you are blinded to certain facets of life that you will never ever have to think that other people are going through until you actually go through, right? And I think in order for the majority groups to be able to try and open their eyes a little bit, or to try and be able to see what's going on the other side of the fence, it first requires you to have that, to suspend that judgment, as Ishak was talking about, and to be able to say to yourself, okay, maybe I don't know everything about race in Singapore, and maybe there is something on the other side which I might learn something from, right? But if we ask ourselves honestly, how many people are really how many people have that humility to be able to suspend their judgment and suspend their thoughts, right? And to ask yourself, is there something I don't know? Not many, I think. And when it comes to race, I would say that it's very unfortunate that people have very, very cocksure opinions about the topic, right? And it's so puzzling to me, because to me, the more I study about racial relations in Singapore, the more questions I have. It's such a deeply complex topic. So when I hear people say things like, we solve the problem of racism in Singapore, or racism penetrates every facet of life in Singapore, like these extreme comments, right, are very unnuanced, and I think the truth is somewhere along the middle, as often as it is, right? So to sum up, I think ideally what I would like to be able to see when I see topics being discussed on race is that people are coming to the topic with an open mind, and people are coming to approach the topic not because they want to jump on the opportunity to score political points, which I think totally does a disservice to the very minorities that both sides claim to be speaking for, because the ones who suffer are not the political hooligans that are making the most noise on Facebook and Instagram, right? The ones who suffer are the racial minorities themselves, because there's so much noise being made in the discourse, and people are avoiding the topic of race, and policymakers have to tread extra carefully around these problems, because they need to be, well, as politicians, you need to win elections, right? And to win elections, you need to be popular. So you need to avoid treading on these landmines, right, so to speak. And yeah, I think this, what I would like to see is that we can all take a step towards finding common ground and finding agreement, and less of that political showboating tactics, which I think is ultimately very, very regressive. Thank you.
谢谢。
Study that I mentioned just now, it's we look at how students navigate diversity. So it's all forms of diversities, and it doesn't focus just solely on the racial bias. Yeah, so it could be like, language. It could be stream and various other forms of diversities that they experience as part of their everyday multiculturalism, and also it's also generally their lives, not just within the school system. Yeah, thanks.
我们收到很多的问题，反应非常的踊跃。可能我需要结合一两个问题，就是用比较概念式的来讨论。一个问题，我觉得可能可以请伯乐先谈的，就是说这个外来的影响。当我们在谈种族歧视或者是种族主义 racism， 它跟这种排外主义 xenophobia 之间有什么差异？就是说我想到的例子就是说目前之前是因为这个所谓的南亚变种病毒，然后间接的促使了就是在本地发生对所谓的印度族群的这种敌意。但是与此同时，你如果把这个放得大一点的话，就是之前包括其他的所谓的新移民，包括从中国来的新移民，他们是来自一个单一族群的背景。他可能对怎么跟少数种族相处，他可能完全没有概念。这些情况会不会就是说让本地的这种种族关系，或者是容易发生种族误解这样的情况更加的复杂化？你从你关心这个外劳的这个经验来看，你觉得有这方面的问题吗？
So thanks for the question. I was hoping we'd avoid the work that I do, but we've gone there anyway. I think there are many dimensions to how different groups of people, whether they are short-term residents, long-term immigrants, how they affect the Singapore story. I think what we can conclude is that we have our work cut out for us, even by ourselves, right? But what we cannot avoid is the fact that, in many instances, we also suffer the effects of globalized, developed countries, aging population and things like that. And one of the effects of this is that perhaps we have a shrinking workforce. And I don't think it's only because of that issue. Perhaps maybe in terms of number has increased. But I believe the beautiful part about the Singapore story is that all of us are the descendants of immigrants. So in a way, if you think about it, it's just whether you got here earlier or later, right? But what we cannot deny is that, few generations of us, we see ourselves as Singaporeans today. And then there are new immigrants that come in over time. The group that I serve, we wouldn't call immigrants. They are more long-term visit pass holders that come and help augment our workforce. And one of the things that the Migrant Worker Center does is to try and promote harmonious coexistence with the local community, among migrant workers and the local community. And, you know, to be very honest, when we started more than 10 years ago, I would say that at that time, the feeling amongst Singaporeans in respect of, you know, your work permit level migrant workers from China, India, Bangladesh, the majority, was largely apathetic. You know, so long as it's not in my backyard, not in my face, I understand the macro argument why we need them here, but so long as it doesn't interfere with my own enjoyment of my life. But a few things have happened along the way, you know, whether or not planned, well, none of them were planned, actually. You know, we had the strike amongst the SMRT bus drivers, and then we had the Little India riot. We also had SG50 celebrations, you know, and along the way, a very clever person, and this is all also because of social media, decided to come out and say that, hey, look, you know, we revel in all our achievements. As Singaporeans, look at our roads, look at our tracks, look at our blocks, you know, HDB and MRT, and look at all our, you know. And then this very clever person said, how many of you built them with your own hands? So then there was a realization, you know, in 2015 that Singapore has always had friends, you know, and we've always been able to count on our friends to help us along the way. And to be very honest, you know, my own experience is that even though they are transient Indian, Bangladeshi, Chinese workers that come and spend 2 years, 4 years, 6 years here working, when they go back, they take with them ties of this affiliation to Singapore, you know. They're not citizens, but they love our country. They have a certain level of even, I would say, even loyalty to our country, right? And they see themselves as an integral part of the Singapore story, you know. And so through the years, and especially with COVID-19 and our experience through COVID-19, where I felt the problem, you know, there was huge challenges in the migrant worker environment, but then the Singaporeans responded, you know, with a show of support and solidarity. And then the workers saw and they responded back. And then the Singaporeans, you know, then enhanced their efforts, you know. And I've actually gone on TV and I actually said that, you know, I hope that this bodes well for our future together, you know. I hope that as we come out of this, when we do, I hope it's no longer us and them. I hope it is now all of us together. I don't think many Singaporeans will say that they have issues with these migrant workers. I think the ones that have raised issues or objections are probably directing their comments at a different group of immigrants. So I don't want to profess to be an expert on an area which I'm obviously not. But I must say that we've got to have, like Donovan says, you know, we've got to come at this from a perspective of humility, and we must have empathy. You know, everyone has their reasons for being here. Your reason, in your mind, is more important than my reason. But who are you to judge me to say that you have more right? You know, and I think that is why we use different words, but I think generally we're all saying the same thing. Keep the conversation going. Do not judge. Be able to and want to put yourself in the shoes of, the other side, whether you're majority versus minority, minority to a majority. Try to understand their perspectives. And only then we'll be able to carry on a constructive conversation.
Yeah.
Hello. Just a quick point, right? So I couldn't agree more with a lot of what you just said, right? And on the topic of migrant workers, I think it's very unfortunate that when there was an outbreak in the dormitories, there were instead of having like very sane discussions around how we can address the outbreaks and how we can prevent for these types of circumstances to ever happen again, I tend to find that a lot of the conversations are very racially charged, right? The people who are determined to believe that this is not really this is all the fault of the government, and there's some kind of like racial motivation behind it. I think it's just very, this is a good example of what I mean when I say that we shouldn't try to attach a racial intention to everything that happens wrongly in society, right? And to the point of like being an immigration nation, it's maybe it's a little bit more relevant because of the recent discussions around CICA and that free trade agreement, right? And it's very puzzling to me because Singapore is only what, 56, 57, about 60 years old, and we already have Singaporeans who identify as like a core, as like a native, and as like I'm like the land, the owners of this land, And if you look at, let's say, America gained its independence in 1776. And the narrative in America is that still it's a land of immigrants. And that was, what, 300 years ago? Singapore is only 60 years old. So where is this idea coming from? That, we are already like owners of the land, right? And so I think it's very unfortunate that a lot of the discussions around migrants are very racially charged. And I think maybe on the part of the government, what they should do is to take steps to integrate the migrants with the native population. If you're always going to keep them out of sight, out of mind, in the backyard, in a dormitory where they're isolated, then you can't blame native Singaporeans for tending to hold certain stereotypes about this group of people who they never ever interact with. And I think the first step we should take is to try and integrate and to try and be more exposed to these people. And I mean, there are a lot of organizations like yours and migrant organizations that do a lot of good work in this area. I think I think as far as I'm concerned, you guys are like leading the charge on this. I think it's very encouraging.
谢谢。伊萨德，你有要补充的吗？针对这个就是种族主义 racism 跟排外情绪这种 xenophobia， 因为我之所以这样问，就是我又联想到其中的最近这一连串的例子，其中有一件我印象比较深刻的是一个所谓的本土的印度同胞对他认为的新印度移民的一个指责，说啊，你有 serve NS 吗？你有当过兵吗？就是像刚才文义讲的，他认为这块土地是他的，而这个是一个新来的人。所以这个种族关系是不是跟这种排外的情绪又勾连在一起？伊萨德有什么观点要补充的吗？
Yeah. I think it's a very important question about racism and xenophobia. Frankly, it's a very complex topic. It's not easy for us to deconstruct or to deep dive into some of the personal encounters or some of the lived experiences which people have shared with me. But what I can share is Singapore are made up of immigrants who came in the 1800s and 1900s. Before independence, we had Chinese who came in from China. We had the various sub-ethnic groups. We had Indians who came in from India. The various sub-ethnic groups as well. And I think in our earlier conversation with Mr. Sim, previously before this panel discussion, he also shared about how the Teochews, the Hakkas, the Cantonese, everyone had their own enclaves that exist. Even amongst the Indians, you had the Sindhis, you have the Punjabis, you have the Malayalis, the Tamil-speaking ones, and so on. And frankly, the nature of how things were structured back then, as you were sharing, is each of them lived independently and separately, and there wasn't by design them living together or identifying themselves as Singaporean first. And it took many years of nation building, many years of getting people to understand that despite whatever their ethnic groups or sub-ethnic groups they are from, they are Singaporeans. And I'm very heartened to see people like Donovan and a lot of the younger generation looking past the post racial classification. But I think let's come back to the point what you mentioned about xenophobia is we shouldn't close ourselves off to the rest of the world. And being an open economy, being a country which is small with not much of natural resources, what we have to realize is that people will be coming to Singapore, they will be living in Singapore, they'll be working in Singapore, contributing back to the economy, and it can be a transient population. Some may decide to take root here and see Singapore as their home and to build a future with their children and grandchildren and so on. There will be inevitably people who will come for purposes of work. They'll work for a number of years, and they realize that perhaps the job is done or they want to move on to a different field and they go to another part of the world. And being an open economy, what you're also seeing is a lot of, as what Donovan mentioned about the Sika debate in Parliament, as well as, what you mentioned specifically about new immigrants versus old immigrant. I think what we have to realize is, as a young nation, which, Donovan said 60 years of age or so, what we have to realize is that inevitably there will be Indians who will be third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation, and so on. There will also be Indians who have come to Singapore in the past 10, 20 years and who decide to make this their home and to, establish themselves here. And not just for Indians, same goes for people from the other ethnic groups as well. We as Singaporeans have to be, I think, a bit more understanding and accommodating because our forefathers at some point came to Singapore like how these people came to Singapore. And everyone should be valued based on the merit of their contribution and not because of the skin color or ethnic background or racial or religious background that they hail from or they profess. Unfortunately, these incidents, I feel that are not, in isolation. I think is because of the fact that they may have some experience in the past which might have shaped that perspective of these people reacting in a certain manner. And we have to really sit down with the person. I think one of the questions that was asked also, I talked about tolerance and I talked about moving on from tolerance to appreciation and developing friendship and so on. It's not so simple. I would like to qualify that. And I would like to say a lot of education has to go into this process. Educating the various ethnic group. And also by design, we have to bring them together such that they're able to interact. I've got friends who share with me in their JC that, they came from all Chinese SAP schools and they never had a Malay or an Indian friend or a Muslim friend. And they asked me, I'm an Indian Muslim, so you celebrate Deepavali? And I said, no, I don't celebrate Deepavali. I'm a Muslim, so I celebrate Hari Raya. Hey, but you're Indian, how come you never celebrate Deepavali? Deepavali is a religious festival, not an ethnic festival, So I think in every opportunity where people are not able to understand some of these differences, it's an opportunity for me to educate and for opportunity for others to educate as well. And even for new immigrants and immigrants who have been in Singapore, be it Indians and other Chinese or Malays, I think what we have to realize is it's an opportunity for us to extend an olive branch even after the incident, but it takes a lot of courage and it's not easy to really understand where these people are coming from, what is the incident that happened in the past that has shaped their opinion, and to give them that perspective that look, I'm a Singaporean as much as you are a Singaporean, and even though they're naturalized Singaporean, it is, and at the end of the day, it is the fact that they are Singaporeans and we have to be mindful of them, we have to respect them for who they are. And even if they are not Singaporean, as a human being, this is fundamental. You have to respect each another and not discriminate and to put them down. And I think we have to be mindful of this when we conduct ourselves in public, because these days things can go very viral. This can go very viral such that people can just take a video, they can post a comment, they can make a somewhat of a post on social media that can really go viral, and people will then take it out of context. There will be response to the response that is being shared, and it can really go out of hand. So I think what we need to do is, as in what we have here, dialogues, we need more of such dialogues to happen at various levels, at workplaces, at schools, at an organizational level, at a grassroots level. We need to raise the awareness first. We need to build such safe spaces for people to interact, to learn from and hear from different perspectives, and build that understanding. And through these kind of discussions, educate themselves, or have their eyes opened up. And also, from then on, I hope that we'll reach a stage where we're able to appreciate each other for our diversity and not just see our differences.
好的，谢谢。沈先生有要补充的吗？
这个是个非常有趣的问题。我记得不久前，看到一则新闻，一位华裔的安哥，他到医院去复诊的时候，那个护士是外地应该是移民外地来做工的。他看到他是华人，他用华语跟他讲，他觉得冒犯了他，他觉得说，你以为我不会讲英语为什么你一看到我就用华语跟我讲？这样看的话，这个叫做排外，是吧？是不是排外心理？但是假设说换成这一个安哥是一个其他族群的，你用华语跟他讲，他会觉得说，你冒犯了我，你这个种族歧视啊！所以这个是一个刚才我们在谈的这个很有趣的问题，是不是？这个可能会带出另外一个问题：为什么会产生这种情况？我们不能，可能就是因为我们缺乏了一个包容、谅解跟互相这个扶持的这些因素在里边可能是因为我们一路来发展到今天这个社会变得更加物质化了不像我们50、60年代的时候，我们之所以这么多不同族群的人在一起，然后呢，我们发展到今天，其实就是因为我们各个族群里面有包容、有谅解、有互相扶持的这一些美德在里边，所以我们才能够走到今天。然后到了今天，为什么这些东西淡了、没有了或者消失了？这个可能是我们应该再去探讨的一个问题。
好的，谢谢。在我们继续之前，我想请问5位，我们有时间吗？因为其实时间到了，但是问题还有一些有趣的问题。如果各位同意的话，我们是不是再延长这个讨论的时间多半小时？各位同意吗？好的，谢谢。那我这边有一个问题是问那个邵师的，就是说您是在这个教育学院工作，确实我们要解决这个种族的问题，下一代是很重要的。那跟下一代最直接接触的就是老师，所以在训练老师的时候，你觉得有一个提问是这样子，就是未来的老师应该具备怎么样的知识，在教导孩子关于这种种族关系、多元主义等等的时候，他们应该具备怎么样的知识？那么随着越来越多就是外地来的老师， 他们又要如何就是能够承担起这样的一种重大的责任？你自己就是从你的专业来看，你有什么意见呢？
我们的那个研究当中，我现在开始讲中文了 ，sorry 。
没关系，没关系，我们有同步翻译。
Natural reflex. Yeah. Okay, in my study, I think just now, I think when we're talking about migrants, right, and we talk about the importance of education and all that, actually that reminded me of how we came across many migrant students in our study. You know, so they are already in our midst, right, in the education system. And sometimes it's very interesting because if you just talk to them about their experiences, right, it's very hard to tell apart some of the migrant students and some of the Singapore citizen students who have lived overseas before. Because we have students who Singapore citizen students who might have been with their parents overseas, Hong Kong, UK, wherever, right? And they only settled sort of more permanently in Singapore, like maybe in primary school. And we see a lot of new migrant students doing that as well. And Singapore, they came here at a young age, and this is probably like the place that they have spent the most time, you know, because we're dealing with like school students at age of 13, 14, right? So they have not advanced, you know, so much in their lives yet. So it's like at least half the period of, you know, their age they've been here. And actually most of them you see, because they've been socialized in the mainstream environment, there isn't much of a difference, except that of course, if they're still considered new immigrant, right, with the quotation marks, and if their ethnicity is different from what we're used to, like the CMIO, right, sometimes, yeah, you still get to hear all these various jokes and name callings too. So that comes up quite a bit. Yeah, so this is something that the educators and the school system and maybe the society as a whole has to deal with. Because it's quite convenient to say, you know, the school needs to do a lot, educators need to do a lot, but we also see how, when we look at the sources of information, right, from the students, they mention family, right, they mention neighbors, they mention like social media, which of course, like, you know, as digital citizens, they are very exposed to. So there are a lot of sources for them to refer to and to consult, and so I think we need to build that up as a community. And as for educators, from what I understand, we have like the CCE, right, the Character and Citizenship Education, right, where they have like recently it's sort of revamped, and they're trying to introduce, trying to get more educators to discuss about such topics. There's like newsletters and all that, right, to encourage them to like develop more professionally. I think the environment as a whole needs to be sort of more friendly, right, towards discussing, you know, sensitive topics. The parameters, I think we need to open it up a bit more. Yeah, so that they feel comfortable as well to talk about it. Yeah, because you do get educators who wonder, right, if, you know, they might get into trouble in discussing, you know, certain issues, because don't forget, we all are products, you know, of our society, of the system. So if we have not been accustomed, right, to talking about sensitive issues, we need that kind of safe environment to gradually open up. Yeah. So, yeah, that's all I have to say for the moment. Thank you.
好的，谢谢。Ershad，你有要补充的吗？
Yes. Yes, thanks for sharing that, Dr. Teng. What I would like to add is that recently, last month, I was in a dialogue session with teachers. So this was organized by Ministry of Education. It's an Excel Fest Spotlight session. And they had a few hundred teachers joining in. And in my sharing as a panelist, I was talking about having sensitive conversation, talking about interreligious dialogues, talking about interracial harmony and so on. And I think that's when I realized many teachers want to talk about this to their students in a class setting. However, they feel that, what are the OB markers, whether they're able to hold the ground when talking about these sensitive topics with students, they were quite hesitant to do so. And I think before we get to the students, I think it's also important to equip the teachers with the necessary skill sets. But is it a school environment that is the right environment for us to hold these dialogues or this kind of discussions in a class setting? That's something that we have to debate and we have to talk about. Because as it is, the school curriculum is, weighing down on the teachers, and they have to do a lot of things, in a class setting to manage this. So I just wanted to add that part, because as much as it's convenient for us to say that, the teachers, are the solutions to all the problems, at the same time, from their perspective, when I heard and when I interacted with them, what I realized was, they're also having so many other things to fulfill, and, they may feel inadequate to talk about these topics in a classroom setting, and especially hold their ground and engage the students on these topics. However, I think we should not stop trying. There's obviously a lot of things that we can do, and I believe that the schools have the Values in Action VIA as part of the curriculum, where we can get experts who are able to talk or deep dive into these topics and engage the student population on these issues. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, perhaps maybe it's because some of the teachers feel uncomfortable or maybe are a bit fearful of broaching the topic. And one of the things they might do in a situation like that was to find a similar proxy direction, to go in. And in that respect, I have to say that even before COVID-19, if I were to plot a chart in Singaporean youth and students' concern for, interest in, wanting to get involved in working with migrant workers, low-wage migrant workers, the kind that live in dormitories, that work in construction sites and our shipyards, right? The graph that I would plot would be one that's gradually and consistently increasing along the way, and then it all culminates with COVID-19. When, like Donovan says, so many ground-up groups have sprouted up, Many of them started up by Singaporean youth, students in university, some in junior colleges and things like that. And this is consistent with the fact that over the last few years, every year when you come to about the time of the year when everybody goes and does their projects, I believe other migrant activist organizations like ours experience the same, consistent experience, a surge in calls from teachers, from students, from project groups, can we work together? Can we partner? We have an idea. Can we toss the idea to you and see what you think? Would you have resources? Can we support? Can we do vacation attachments and things like that? And I know this is good for my sector of work. But I was just thinking just now when Arshad was mentioning his conversation with the teachers, maybe the teachers are encouraging this as a proxy to try and slowly massage people through to the area where perhaps today they still feel a little bit uncomfortable with. And then rather than say, we have an immediate conversation with fellow citizens of different ethnicities, we do the migrant workers first and then prepare, the ground, so to speak.
Yeah. Just a quick intervention. I think adding on to what Bernard said is, so after that forum that I spoke at, what we realized was, there's a need to develop a toolkit for effective dialogue on race and religion, and that's what we did at the non-profit organization Rose of Peace. We developed a toolkit to educate the students on it, and we're having a workshop that's coming up. But what I mean to say is that this awareness is now building up. this dialogue, this panel discussion we're having is in line with that. And we're seeing many other opportunity for people to talk about this in various settings. There are many organizations talking about racial harmony. There's the board that I sit on for One People at SG deals with this, and it has been doing this ever since it was set up in 1996. And they have constant engagement on the ground, talking to people from the school setting, from from a corporate setting, from a community standpoint. So they have various engagement, and I urge all the viewers who are interested to know about these topics, who are keen to understand more further, who want to get to know people from the other ethnic groups even better, or the religious groups, to reach out to this organization. IRCC, it was set up by in the Ministry of by the ministry, and IRCC exists in every constituency. So get involved, reach out to them, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to share with you some of the avenues of the platform for the people to get engaged in. So Rose of Peace, most welcome, and I'm sure any of our panelists or Lianhe Zaopao can offer that avenue for you to reach out to them such that they can point you the right direction to really understand this space and to get involved and to build your understanding and develop an appreciation for the diversity that we have in Singapore.
Some of the schools that we've been to, right, some of them have made quite good efforts in terms of like engaging external vendors. Yeah, so maybe, like your onepeople.sg, though, I think there's one that we saw which is very successful because it was still within the school environment, right? This one whole level of students were invited to dialogue, and the vendor basically set a very safe environment, trying to engage the students, asking them to set the ground rules together, right? If we were to talk about certain issues that matters to you most at heart, right? What would be a respectful way of approaching? What are the, say, key words that we have to remember, right? Respect and so on and so forth. And interestingly, right, although the students had a very slow start, they're very slow to warm up, but Singaporeans as a whole are quite slow to warm up. But gradually, they started saying things that matter, even sharing things like, I had a friend who committed suicide, and what was the reason behind it and all that, right? What were the labeling and how did people see him, so on and so forth. So it was, and of course, different issues came up as well, biases, prejudices of various sorts. So I think they've been trying, and I think it would be good if educators could also follow up, because vendors are not in school all the time. So if there could be some kind of facilitation where, they can have a longer term follow-up, I think that would be great. Yeah.
好，谢谢大家。其实我们还有很多问题，我就总结。其实有3-4个问题，我把它总结成一个问题，结合我们至今所讨论的来问。就是说，刚才尔莎提到说 toolkit 工具箱，就是在老师要怎么跟学生讨论，或者是老师本身有没有具备这个讨论的能力。我觉得除了态度之外，其实我们用什么概念，用什么方式，甚至是提高到理论的层次，因为问题里面有很多讲到 white privilege 一些概念，讲到比如说刚才文艺说的 systemic racism， 讲到种族批判主义，有好几个问题都有这些，就是这些不是根据新加坡的实际情况所出现的概念。我发现提问的时候，里面有一点点情绪在，所以就是说我们因为长期缺乏讨论这种敏感问题的经验。所以我们也缺乏那个恰当的或者是适合我们的语言来进行这样的讨论。所以不知道各位有什么看法，就是我们要如何发展出一套我们可以用来讨论我们自己问题的语言跟概念。要不要请邵师先开始？这个估计是最后一个问题了，会相对敏感一点，我估计。
I think obviously, okay, I think in terms of adopting terms and terminology and all that, I mean, we are no strangers to a lot of imports actually. So it's a matter, it's not so much that, whether a term or concept is imported, but it's like, how do we use it? Do we know how to use it in a relevant way, and do we know its limitations? And then if there are limitations, how do we address it? Because there's no perfect term, right? So I think a lot of historical and sociological contextualization needs to go into it. A lot of exchanges, and like I think just now what some of my panelists here mentioned, like the building of consensus, as we go along. And maybe this is something that is, like I think Bernard also mentioned earlier, it may need some revisiting from time to time as well, because different generations have different challenges too. Yeah, and I think if I could recommend, I think there's a historian, Tsai Siu-min, right, who has written something about how, say Chinese privilege is or is not quite the same as white privilege, but why, how is it sort of relevant to Singapore? I think that's written both in English, there's an English version and there's a Chinese version, and it's quite complex because there's a lot of histories and a lot of discussion of terms, but if anyone's interested, I think that could be something to follow up on.
I think just now I already mentioned, when it comes to the word racism, or trying to describe what that means without using racism, I myself am handicapped, and I use possibly not very accurate terms. I use, discrimination, prejudice, and I think actually it's not me alone that suffers from this issue. Certainly, many of the people in my generation, I think we have that same fear of the word racism. But I think it's important to ask, why do we have the fear of the word racism? Because we know in other contexts, perhaps, in other situations, people have, if you don't mind me borrowing a word that's been used, actually also in this context by another academic, people have weaponized the word racism so that the word itself creates hatred, creates hurt, pain. So I think, yes, a lot of us are so handicapped that, we can't carry on in conversation because we don't even have the language, to carry out these conversations. So, as I said earlier on, I think I agree. We will build this language up if the need to have this conversation is important to us enough, and we recognize this. Then together we will have to build this toolkit or language or the terminologies that we will need to use, and we need to agree on what terminologies to use such that it does not offend, it's not weaponized. This term, since I brought it up, this term, Chinese privilege, the academic that I'm quoting, actually, I feel makes a very good point. Because in some conversations, people have thrown the word Chinese privilege out in order to halt the conversation, to close the conversation. It's the getting my last word in, dropping the mic and walking away, Language like that we should stay very far away from. That can be weaponized, right? And that's all I think we should be very, very aware of. All of us together, majority, minority, very aware of, yeah.
Yeah, I have so much thoughts on this, and we're running out of time. But maybe what I would just say is that, whenever the term Chinese privilege keeps coming up, right? And whenever it comes up, someone asks, the question is typically asked in the fashion of, do you believe that there is such a phenomenon, right? And it's such a clunky question because what do you mean by Chinese privilege, right? If by Chinese privilege you mean that being in the racial majority, I will be able to get hired in the labor market a little bit easier, or I might be able to find a group mate or like a colleague, work with colleagues in a Chinese-dominated environment easier, then yes, I think that there is some kind of Chinese privilege to that extent. But that's not quite the way that the term is being marshaled in, I think, always. People tend to use that term to extrapolate it to some kind of pervasive form of racism that is entangled with every facet of society. And then that's where I really like take a pause and it's like, okay, well, hang on a second, right? I agreed with you before, but now you're trying to extend it to like a macro level. And when you do that types of extrapolations, you need a lot more historical nuance and context before you can actually say that, yes, there is such a phenomenon, right? And I do not think that the people who extrapolate it to the macro level have done that kind of nuanced thinking and analysis. They are just, like you're saying, right? They are just marshalling the term as like a kind of political ammunition, right? To like dominate the conversation and say that, this is my race, you're that race, and you have Chinese privilege, therefore you're wrong. And I totally agree that this is the types of conversations we need to try and avoid as much as possible, because it shuts down conversation when we should be trying to open up the conversation, right? And racism is such a contentious issue because it's very visible, it's very tangible, and the only way for us to be able to open up that conversation is if we have the kind of humility and empathy when we approach these topics. But if your automatic position is that this is my concept, you have it, then it doesn't invite conversation, right? It doesn't quite open up any dialogue at all, and it certainly doesn't persuade anyone who disagrees with you. And I think that's the point, right? Persuasion. When you enter the conversation, are you persuading the other side? The people who don't believe that racism is a problem, are you trying to convince them that it is a problem to some extent? And the people who believe that racism is a widespread issue, can we try and get them to hunker down a little bit and go, okay, yeah, maybe it's not a problem everywhere. Maybe the government has done some things right, and there are some problems that we need to address. So that is the kind of nuance and unfortunately slightly boring conversations that no one wants to engage, right? Because it's much easier for me to make a claim rather than make a claim then caveat it like 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Thanks.
I think Donovan reinforced the point already. I go back to what I said earlier about intention, and then we discussed, wanting to understand, wanting to learn, that spirit of being inclusive and getting closer rather than being further apart. And I think that is exactly, at least to me, that's exactly how I see terminologies like this, which I feel we should veer away from when we are thinking about developing the right language and toolkits to discuss this as we move forward. I think ultimately, many of the panelists, my fellow panelists, have also said, multiracialism, multiculturalism, yes, we maybe do better than most folks at it, but we would be lying to ourselves if we didn't ourselves admit that it still is, and it's going to be for a long time a work in progress. And the only way we will get there, the promised land, whether or not we do, is to keep working at it and to keep working at our deficiencies. For example, if we don't have the language, then we need to talk about developing something. Then we need to talk about drawing the red lines and OB markers. Then the toolkits to teach our children. I think it will always be a work in progress, right? Yeah.
I just want to add, when Bernard was talking about Chinese privilege, he mentioned it. One of the, in the trainings that I've had, is one of the participants said, he's a Chinese himself, he's from a SAP schools, and he said, hey, don't say Chinese privilege lah. I said, then say what? Then he said, say majority blind spot, So, and I thought that was a fantastic, sharing, because the moment you say Chinese privilege, and if you're a Chinese wanting to have that conversation with another person, you'll be on the defensive ready, because you feel that you're being, targeted, or you have to, take a certain course of action in the discourse. So, that terminology that was used, there was majority blind spot. I thought that was quite, interesting. And I thought, and subsequently in all our discussions, conversations, and our workshops, etc., we use the word majority blind spot, which I think, perhaps is a better, accurate way of, holding identifying and using that word to denote what the privileges may be for the majority in a society, right? So.
沈先生有要补充的吗？
这个现在在谈的这个说，在交流的时候用那个恰当的 terminology 这，其实这个是已经问题发生的，而真正的这些不愉快的事件，这些发生的是从那个草根，从 community 市区上来的，所以我觉得说这个东西是发生了以后再沟通，要用什么共同的这个语言，而我觉得我自己本身的经验我在新加坡还是在马来西亚的时候，我们上课的时候我们都有读马来文，所以我从那边学到的一些基本的马来话今天对我来讲是非常受用。我发现我跟我的左邻右舍的马来同胞邻居交流比其他的华族同胞更加容易更加融洽。所以我觉得说，不知道可能我们可以考虑在一些市区，比如民众俱乐部还是什么的，开办一些就是不同族群的基本的这个语言课程，让大家去学习，然后可以加强理解。我觉得可能那个可以不用等到事件发生了以后，我们才把问题放在台面上来讨论。我觉得我的看法是这样。
我被要求说尽可能把问题具体的问出来。来，还有补充的，来请。
Yeah, Mr. Sim said something that sort of triggered a thought in me. He said, "What language to speak?" And I think in all of this discussion and discourse that we have to speak first and foremost with respect, with compassion, and with kindness. And I feel these are the universal languages of humanity. And when we, center ourselves in that way, then we can avoid, all of these very unfortunate circumstances.
I was thinking of a term that I was trying to recall during the conversation, and I finally recalled it. And the term that I was looking for is good faith, right? Approaching conversations in good faith. And I think as long as people are unable to do that, right, to approach the topic with good faith, which is to mean that you don't ascribe evil intentions to the other person, you don't automatically think the worst of the other person, then no amount of language toolkits will ever help you. Because if you are coming into the conversation with that type of hostility and confrontational attitude, then the conversation will never open, right? The analogy that I would give is, suppose like you're part of a company and everyone is working in the same company trying to develop a successful product. Do you think that the company will be likely to succeed if every single team member was trying to undermine each other and trying to show that their idea is better than the others and that they should be the one getting the promotion and the other person should get fired? Any work environment that has that kind of toxicity will likely fail. And I think that's what's happening on the topic of race, unfortunately. You have a lot of people who are just not interested in having conversations. They are interested in making a moral grandstand, unfortunately. Debates, if you call it that, yeah. And I think that's what I would like to see is that people dial back the moralism and try to have a bit more open mind as to where they might be wrong. Easier said than done, of course, but yeah, I think that's the direction that we should go toward.
我们其实收到很多的问题，我被要求把一些问题念出来，至少让线上的这些来宾也有参与感。那最后我是想，我们以这样的方式结束，我把问题一题念出来，各位觉得有哪一题你们觉得特别有话要讲的，我可以把问题念完之后，你们选择来回应，好吗？好，那我开始了。有些是英文的，我就直接用英语念了。I hope we can get these answered and uncomfortable questions I ask because the perception is that it is the Chinese, especially Chinese-speaking, who don't think there is racism. So how should this group be persuaded to think otherwise? What level of toleration before they start fighting back? I would like to know if this discomfort is more applicable to the minority race than the majority race than the minority race. The last panelist talks about the level of discomfort that is tolerable when talking about race. I would like to know if this discomfort is more applicable to the majority race than the minority race. I think the discomfort would come from being asked about the position of privilege, whatever that means. The minorities probably have no problems talking about their ethnic issues. The Chinese community often talks about trauma stemming from the loss of Nanta and Chinese schools, but minority communities such as the Malays have also lost schools that were integral to their identity, such as Sanila Utama School. Is the Chinese community also aware that they are not the only ones to have suffered these traumas and losses, and how does this change the conversation on Chinese privilege? 很多情绪会带进来，就是它有趣跟敏感的地方也在这里。Some would think that picking up Chinese will be a way to fill up the gap between the different races, and that it will be a helpful tool in the future to expose one to more job opportunities. Many say that this is due to the benefit of being multilingual, but some feel that it is due to Chinese priorities in our society, as it helps them to fit in. What are your opinions on this issue? 这个可能我们未必都能够在这里解答，但是我也希望各位能够带着这些提问回去，以后有机会的时候，可以在其他的场合来探讨。To what extent might the intersections of privilege identity possibly lead to blind spots in objective assessment of the presence of systemic privilege in Singapore? Is there a specific reason for comparing systemic privilege to Xinjiang Uyghur issue? I'm not sure if I heard Mr. Choi correctly, so may I invite him to clarify? Is he saying that everyone who sees systemic racism in Singapore is guilty of treating racism as one, the only issue that matters, and two, guilty of thinking that discrimination in Singapore is as bad as in Malaysia or China? If he actually means that some people who see structural racism hold these extreme views, would he acknowledge that others hold more reasonable views about systemic racism in Singapore, and that skeptics like him should practice what he advocates by seeking common ground with those who hold reasonable views that happen to differ from his? 这一题是用中文的。最近在新加坡的种族问题好像主要是和外来的工作人士有关。一路来我们4大种族都相安无事，零星的种族摩擦事件固然是有，但并不太严重。我们担心的是，不少国人用社交媒体发表他们在种族方面的极端看法，不知道有什么方法可以减少这种现象。另一题是 From the emotional analysis done by 早报, there were many netizens using the haha emoji as comments on race-related FB posts. What does this say about people's perception on race-related issues? Is this worrying, or if Singaporeans are using angry or sad emojis instead of haha emojis, which would be a more worrying sign? Are there new ways we can engage Singaporeans to discuss race-related issues objectively, given that people are now used to commenting and sharing opinions on social media and remaining anonymous? This is to Menon. I agree somewhat that intentions behind comments do matter, and the listener can be kind enough to look towards a possible intention before replying. I also feel that this can also be a way comments of a racial, colorist, or ethnic nature can easily be masked as innocent. In what ways do you think questions that seek understanding can be phrased so that the intention is clear? This way we can avoid the damages that minority self-esteem and identity can be limited, and we call out individuals who hide nasty intention behind coy words. 我看我们最后是逆次序，先从邵师开始，然后回到最后沈先生逐一选择你们对刚才我念的这些问题有什么你们觉得特别想回应的？那完了之后我们就可以结束了。如果邵师还没准备好，Manning 可以开始。
I think the last question flashes in everybody's mind, so I'll quickly, before I even forget that. Yeah, you know, I agree. I agree with the person who posed the question that I may oversimplify to say, you know, I mean, to me, I've always tried to look behind at the purpose of asking the question or you know, that particular interaction. And I have to admit myself, very often it wasn't clear whether, you know, there was any malice or negative intent behind it, right? But I think what I've always tried to practice is to give the benefit of the doubt. I mean, being a minority, it's not difficult to give a benefit of the doubt. And I found as a result of that, or that in most cases, there was this humility, empathy, you know, this spirit of wanting to understand behind the question. So I think, you know, we are at a point where whether you're minority or majority, you know, it's like everybody looking at what's a good thing to use as an analogy, maybe a swimming pool, but nobody wants to jump in, you know. The majority may say, you know, I may be viewed as a turncoat, maybe the minority may say, why should it be me, you know. But the problem is if we all just keep standing around the swimming pool, no one will ever get wet. So I think that the problem is sometimes we overthink things, you know, and at least in my experience, in my little small backyard, you know, in school and, you know, within my friends, I think what is, regardless of why they ask the questions and all that, so long as I thought I could help clarify or maybe explain, you know, I think ultimately the outcome was positive. And so I would say try and be humble enough so that you can give the benefit of the doubt. Do not jump to conclusions. If you suspend judgment, you know, you probably won't go in that direction. Try not to cut the conversation off, because what we actually want to do now is make the conversation more inclusive and carry it on. And then lastly, sometimes someone needs to go first. And I think, you know, perhaps not think of ourselves as, oh, I'm a minority, I'm a majority, you know. If we think of ourselves as all of us having an equal share in the Singapore story, then it really doesn't matter who goes first. Right? That's what I think. Thank you.
好，谢谢。
I'll just make a very short response. With regards to, you know, like, I'm not sure if I interpret the question correctly. It's like what the Chinese speaking seems to be the most resistant or something like that, is it? To Chinese privilege or the idea of racism. Okay, firstly, I'm not sure if being resistant to the term Chinese privilege equates you know, not recognizing racism, okay? I'm still not very clear. We don't have the data and all that. But I recognize that, when you talk about, say, you've lost Sangnila Utama and, the various schools, and I think we need to recognize that historically there has been dramatic changes, right? Transforming into the first world that we are today, there has been dramatic changes across the communities. And I think maybe for the Chinese, in terms of the Chinese schools, that's maybe even more dramatic in terms of the change. But I would say that, this does not then negate the idea of not flattening, the majority-minority asymmetries, right? When we talk about racism, I think there is still majority privilege in that. Okay, you can say that Chinese may face racism too, but structurally, you probably face a lot less, and the impact of it, the consequences are much less. Yeah, that's my short answer. Yep.
Donovan?
Where to begin? I guess what I would say on this idea that you need to have kind of, I think just to tie it a little bit back, right, to one of the questions that was asked, how can we get the Chinese majority to be a little bit more introspective about their so-called majority privileges or their racial privileges, right? It's a very tough question. And I say that because I've spoken to many of my peers who hold these deeply entrenched views, who would not hesitate about their belief system, right, when it comes to race in Singapore. And it's very, very difficult to change their views because my belief always boils down to the fact that these people are not exposed, right? If you are in an environment where you don't ever have to interact with people who are different from yourself, you will never ever have that capacity to alter your worldview. And you will always cling on to those simple stereotypes that we are trying to very hard to eliminate, right? So off that premise, I would say that if you want to get people in the majority to start looking at people from the racial minorities' perspective, you need to start taking steps to integrate them and to get them exposed. And as much as possible, not in a forcible way, because that's just going to have a backlash, right? Singapore has done many steps to do such what I'm suggesting already. For example, the ethnic integration policy, which has also recently came into the media limelight. I think the EIP is a very good example of a policy that we should do more of in the way that it helps people to coexist peacefully, right, and to expose them outside of their own echo chambers. That's not to say, of course, that the EIP is perfect. There are some problems with it when it comes to like housing market, the kinds of arbitrary definitions it draws on like housing markets for minorities. But the original intention of the EIP, I think it's a very good example of a policy that goes in the right direction. And perhaps I would say that on the point of, let's say, on the point of migrant workers again, we need to be able to, I think that we have such a huge migrant worker population, and to me, it's quite shocking that we can live our lives perfectly in Singapore as citizens without ever having to come across them at all. I mean, there's nothing spontaneous about that, right? That's totally created in a way where we would never ever have to see them in our backyard. And I think that's very unfortunate. And that we do have to take baby steps towards trying to get Singaporeans to be exposed to these people, be it by their stories, through social media. I know social media gets a lot of flack for like being the hotbed of these types of inflammatory remarks, right? But I think what tends to get overlooked also is that social media is very valuable in that it allows people to air their perspectives, which were not possible in a way before we had social media. Okay, so you get the good and the bad, right? And the point always is, how do we minimize the bad while magnifying the good? And maybe the other point on trying to integrate people is to have a more vibrant civil society, such as people like Irshad and Bernard, who are NGOs and civil societies. How do we encourage more of these types of organizations to bridge the gap between the migrant worker population or like the racial minorities and the majorities? And I think it's always easier said than done because people are always biased towards the status quo. But I think taking baby steps is better than brushing the problem away and saying that racism is not an issue in Singapore. So I think that at least it should be the preliminary steps that we should take when it comes from a public policy perspective.
好，谢谢。
Thank you. That's a lot of questions that you read out earlier. I don't know where to start. And in fact, my fellow panelists have, addressed some of them. I think where I'll come from in my, sharing here would be from the perspective that, I think we have come a long way since independence to where we are right now. And even pre-independence with the 1964 riots and even before the 1950. So where we are right now, it's a juncture for us to reimagine how race relations will evolve in Singapore in the years to come. And I think let's focus on that. What has worked well for us for Singapore, we can revisit that. I think there was also debate in Parliament where we have to continuously see and assess, and every generation has to define how this working life document is going to pan out in the future. What are the OB markers? What are the parameters? What can be discussed publicly? What is sensitive in nature? And I think this is a good effort for us to do so. And this effort has to be amplified across all facets of society. And let's not try to also discredit the good work that have gone in the past, by our forebearers and how they've built up Singapore to where it is right now. The lessons for us along the way, we have to learn those lessons and not try to repeat that again. And there's also lessons for us to learn from outside of Singapore, what's happening in the rest of the world, where we can, learn from that experience and us, not going down the same path and making those mistakes when it comes to race and religious harmony. So I'll just leave it at that, and I hope that this is an ongoing process, and I'm very glad that联合早报 is taking this initiative and bringing the discourse to a wider audience in Singapore.
好，谢谢。沈轩。
没有要这个回应任何特定的这个题目，但是我还是要重申，只要我们还是一个多元种族的社会，种族问题是永远存在的，所以我们一定要永远共同去面对这个问题，处理它。我们用宽容、包容、谅解、互相扶持的基础去做。重要不是要比较彼此之间的得失，以交换条件来处理问题。这个是我想表达的。
好，非常谢谢。我们其实已经超过时间1个小时了。显示今天讨论的非常积极，然后提问的问题很多，各位也表达了非常丰富多彩的观点。那就像各位所说的，这个其实是一个没有止境的过程，因为我们要不断的去面对、去处理。但是千里之行，始于足下，反正总是要跨出那个第一步。那今天其实我们能够坐在这里，跟线上的各位来宾一起交流，本身就是一个我觉得是一个成功了。所以希望我们能够用这样的一种尽可能理性、尽可能好奇的方式，继续的去探讨，不断的困扰着我们这个多元种族、多元文化的课题。谢谢大家的参与，非常感谢。